All right, so let's just get started. People will find us along the way. I should have introduced myself. My name is Penny Nambabazi. I work for Center for Economic and Social Rights as a Climate Justice Program Associate, and it's really a pleasure to see you all. As we get right into the discussion, this is a webinar that CESR together with Ruta del Clima are working together on sharing, decoding climate finance, lessons and average ahead of COP30. And as we all know, climate change is the defining issue of our time. Yet climate finance still remains one of the most, least understood dimensions of this crisis. While the impacts of climate change are now undeniable, the resources meant to respond to it often fail to reach those most affected, especially in the global south. And climate finance continues to operate within structures that prioritize profit over people and economic growth over human rights. Today's conversation does take place at a pivotal moment in the lead up to COP30, when global actors are negotiating the future of climate finance amidst deepening debt crisis, the rising adaptation costs, and the systematic inequalities. So this session and this webinar broadly will have two parts. First is really to see how we can be able to have a dialogue, a discussion, mainly about climate finance, not as a technical issue, but about it being about justice, and also about ensuring that climate solutions are equitable and transparent and right-based. But also, as we approach COP30, the voices and experiences of movements, researchers, and communities from the Global South are essential in shaping demands and reimagining the global financial architecture. So today we're here to connect those dots between data, rights, and systematic transformation, but also to strengthen collective action towards a rights-based economy that serves the people and the planet. So I'll just get right into the agenda, and please feel free to leave any questions in the chat in case you need any help. So the agenda for this webinar is that first we'll begin with looking at insights from different speakers who will be sharing insights and also the intersections of human rights, economic justice, and climate finance. And we are honored to be joined by an exceptional panel of experts and advocates. First, we have Benjamin Schachter, who is a human rights officer. And apologies if I pronounce your name badly. I hope you'll be able to correct me. So he's called Benjamin Schachter. He's a human rights officer, and he is a focal point for climate change and the environment at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR, and he brings a rights-based framing to climate finance and accountability. We then have Rebecca Thissen, who is the global advocacy lead at Akina International. She'll be exploring the inequalities in the current financial flows and the role of civil society ahead of COP30. Thirdly, we have Ms. Juliet Namagamba, who is the Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead at Akina Afrika. And she'll be looking at specifically highlighting the feminist and global South perspectives on power, accountability, and justice in climate finance. And then we have Adrián Martínez, who is the director of Ruta del Clima, and we'll be looking at advancing the case of reparation-based climate finance and the role of the advisory opinions in driving systematic change. So together we'll look at how to unpack how we do reclaim and reframe climate finance through a human rights lens. And just to start off, to begin our discussion, I'll invite Benjamin from Office of the UNHCHR just to share his opening remarks on framing climate change as a human rights issue and how aligning climate finance with justice, equity, and accountability can move us forward. Over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you very much. And you got my name just right, so no worries. And very grateful for the invitation and looking forward to the discussion today. Um, so look, the first thing is, why are we talking about climate change as a human rights issue? I'm sure those of you on the call are familiar with that, but to maybe do a quick recap, climate change impacts people's rights, including their right to life, to health, to water, to development, to a right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And in fact, it's been described by High Commissioner after High Commissioner as an existential threat to human rights, one of the greatest threats to human rights. And the impacts right now are already so catastrophic that if it were a different context, the response would be, I think, faster, more substantial in terms of mobilization of finance, and more significant. And so we know that all states have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. That obligation applies in the context of international cooperation and including to mobilize finance. We have seen in the recent decision of the International Court of Justice on the legal obligations of states, the recent advisory opinion, a very clear affirmation of the fact that states have obligations both to exercise the maximum ambition possible to prevent the climate crisis from worsening, and to ensure reparations for the impacts of the climate crisis. And ultimately, a lot of the actions that need to be taken do come down to international cooperation and mobilization of finance. So as this report on Decoding Injustice mentions, current systems are shaped by a history of colonial exploitation, corporate impunity, and unequal governance. And embedding human rights principles in climate finance is essential to dismantle these structural injustices. The new collective quantified goal on finance, which was adopted at the end of COP29, fell short of what human rights advocates and climate justice advocates were pushing for, both in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality, right? The amount of finance being mobilized or committed to is grossly short of the amount of finance needed to address the climate crisis. And the quality of that finance is also not clearly defined. There is no clear commitment to a human rights-based approach. The accessibility of finance to the people who need it most is questionable at best. And the basic safeguards that are needed to ensure that finance, when it's mobilized, is mobilized in a manner consistent with human rights are lacking. And that, of course, is a critical subject of discussion going forward. COP29 committed to develop the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion. So that report was due last week and hopefully is coming this week, but it has been delayed. But again, we have to see and push for and advocate that what's committed to is consistent with state human rights obligations, including as described in the ICJ advisory opinion. So I want to share a little bit more about what those are. Finance should be consistent with the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which calls for the mobilization of the maximum available resources to realize the economic, social, and cultural rights. And this principle should guide climate finance and accountability, including things like taxation, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and regulating financial flows. Finance frameworks should also apply principles sorry about that, such as equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities and respective capabilities, which the ICJ advisory opinion defined as relevant for interpretation of treaties and the determination of rules of customary law relating to the environment. Should guarantee access to remedy. Communities harmed by climate-related projects or inadequate financing must have enforceable rights to restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. It should be measurable. So indicators and benchmarks like the diagnostic tool developed by the Center for Economic and Social Rights called OPRA, focused on outcomes, policy, efforts, resources, and assessment, and described in the report, can be used to help assess whether governments, multilateral institutions, private finance, and other actors are taking action aligned with their human rights obligations. Should be clear that it is a legal obligation rooted in states' duties under human rights law and principles of non-discrimination and equity. So climate finance is not discretionary. And we need to have adequate finance for all pillars of climate action: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and just transition, which is essential to ensuring the fulfillment of a wide range of human rights. It is clearly the case that there should be an understanding that failure to provide adequate finance constitutes a breach of international obligations. So the last couple of things I want to leave you with, and then I'll be happy to hear from the others and be a part of the discussion, is that, you know, the report emphasizes climate reparations should go beyond discussions of loss and damage in the climate negotiations, and they should be considered tools for addressing historical injustices. This is consistent with a human rights-based approach. And also that there's an important role that human rights mechanisms can play by helping to keep track of climate finance commitments and their human rights impacts and reinforcing accountability. And we have, in fact, seen the special procedures of the Human Rights Council and others engaging in this space to advocate for innovative sources of finance and increased finance and human rights-based finance for climate action.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I think you clearly bring out, you know, the aspect of why climate crisis should be a human rights issue, why it's important to center climate finance, you know, on human rights, center human rights in the discussion of climate finance, but also the issues that we see on, you know, to do with quality climate finance and, you know, who is able to actually access these finances. And we know that so many communities, so many countries are actually failing to do so. And there's need to see that takes shape. And looking ahead at the COP30, I believe that's one of the things that this discussion can be able to clearly bring out. And I'm happy to pass it on to our next panelist. And I'll be looking forward to seeing how Rebecca, you're able to, you know, center this discussion also on, you know, who is actually paying, you know, the cost, the price, and the unequal impacts of the climate crisis, but also where should these resources come from? And I'll hand it over to you, Rebecca. You can be able to, you know, share and feel free in the time that you have to make your submissions. Thank you.
Thanks, Penina, and hi everyone. Good to be here with you all. Penina, please cut me if I'm going too long because it's a very wide and complex topic, but I think thanks to Benjamin, my job now will be easier and I can just build on what he already shared. So yeah, I mean, we are in a very difficult situation when it comes to climate finance, also because of the kind of Baku legacy. So the COP29 decision that was taken last year, that is really setting a worrying precedent when it comes to climate finance and climate justice more broadly. And I think I will try to structure the issue, but as well as the solution into like alongside three pillars. quantity, quality, and accountability. And I think Benjamin already talked about those as well. Because we have different problems to face, and we have to make sure we push back against a lot of false solution and false narrative when it comes to those three aspects of climate finance. So first, when it comes to quantity, this is not new, right? The needs embedded in developing countries' climate policies when it comes to mitigation, adaptation, addressing loss and damage, and just transition needs are in the range of the trillions, right? We, as CAN International, have been calling last year in the context of the NCQG negotiation, so the new climate finance goal negotiation, for a target of 1 trillion in public grant-based finance, which is, something that we just took from needs-based literature, right? But we know that the conversation around climate finance are far from meeting those needs. Already the previous 100 billion goal was a political number that was agreed, behind closed doors by some ministers back in Copenhagen and then re-anchored in the Paris Agreement, but it's not science nor need-based and therefore not complying with human rights obligation. According to developed country methodologies, and that's also linked to, of course, the accountability of climate finance, right? Because the methodology used to report on climate finance are developed country owned. So it's the contributing countries who are assessing their own homework, right? So you're the students, but the teacher at the same time. And according to them, the 100 billion goal was met in 2022. But when you look at another methodology, another approach to account for climate finance, and those the report made by Oxfam and CARE this year are really useful, because when they dig into the methodologies, they show that the numbers are actually way below what's being claimed by OECD countries. And so, for example, they say that the actual number in 2022 were ranging between 28 to 35 billion dollars, which is even more worrying and shocking when you look at the needs and of course the extreme climate events that are hitting the global south more and more. Another very important problem, I think, when it comes to quantity is the lack of balance of where the very little amount of climate finance are flowing to, right? They are mostly invested in mitigation policies, and they are often neglecting adaptation, not talking about loss and damage, that's barely absent of the climate finance landscape currently. But that's, of course, going against developing country needs and priorities. And also to mention that just transition policies that are specific and additional are not at all considered in the climate finance landscape. Also, just to recall that, so we moved from the 100 billion goal to now a 300 billion goal, or well, at least 300 billion goal that's supposed to strike a balance between adaptation and mitigation, again, leaving loss and damage off the hook. And just to give you an idea of comparison, the very recent adaptation gap report said that adaptation finance needs sits in a plausible central range between 310 and 365 billion annually. So it means that the whole NCQG, so the whole climate finance goal that was adopted last year, could just cover adaptation needs. So that shows where the quantity is actually far from being adequate. So obviously at COP30, maybe I can also start to answer what we could be doing as civil society on that front. I think it would be very hard to renegotiate a goal that was adopted last year, although seen as, totally, a huge deception and unacceptable by many of us. But I think one thing that we should really fight for is to clarify what part of this 300 billion will go to adaptation, because it's also, one of the priorities that has been neglected, but also how much of public finance, and for us it should be the majority of the whole 300 billion goal, would actually be part of this new climate finance goal. We need to get much more clarity of this provision component of the 300 billion goal. Then coming to quality, there are many things that could be said when it comes to quality, and I don't want to be too long, but I think one thing that needs to be flagged, and it's also a legacy from the 300 billion goal, is the share of loans, right, that are used to channel climate finance, that are creating a vicious circle of indebtedness in developing countries, knowing that not only those loans are problematic when it comes to from a climate justice perspective, but often they are provided at non-concessional rates, which means that they are at market level or even above, right? Which is generating, of course, high interest level and accelerating the debt crisis in the global south. For a crisis, I remind ourselves that they didn't commit in the first place. So I think that the question of loans and the lack of grant-based and non-debt inducing instruments is a fight that we really need to continue picking as civil society, including maybe by continuing to push for an exclusion of commercial loans, so loans beyond market rate in the context of climate finance. And just making sure I'm not taking too long, the third pillar that's also very important, I think Benjamin talked about it as well, is the question of accountability. How do we track, how do we report, and how do we monitor climate finance that's being provided or mobilized? There are many issues in terms of accountability that are problematic and that are making the numbers look much more inflated than they actually are. One big problem is the question of additionality. We know that the majority of climate finance is actually coming from development budget that was known already in many years ago, but there was also a commitment to make sure that climate finance was actually coming on top of ODA, which means that countries have to report on one end what they provide to development assistance, official development assistance, or ODA, and on the other end to distinct that from their climate finance obligation. The problem is that we see in the vast majority of the cases that we are confronted with double counting. So they account for the same budget twice, which is actually much meaning that the finance is much lower in practice. Another big issue when it comes to accountability is the question of a definition of climate finance that we still don't have. It may sound crazy. We are in 2025. We've been talking about climate finance for more than a decade, but we still don't know what we are talking about. And that's not a coincidence. It's a political choice or a political avoidance, rather, from developed countries. Because as long as you don't know what you have to report to, you can account anything under the sink, right? So from ice cream shops to a green hydrogen project that will actually serve your own transition, etc., etc. So I think the question of clarifying what we are talking about, clarifying what can be counted as climate finance, excluding things such as commercial loans, such as carbon markets, such as fossil fuel finance, is maybe basic but essential in the context we are in. And finally, just to wrap up, I think something also very important, and I'm sure Juliet will talk about that, is the fact that the climate finance conversation is embedded in a wider international financial architecture that is working against developing country needs and interests, right? That is perfectly unfair and unbalanced. And so I think, of course, we have to fight to get the best climate finance framework within the UNFCCC, the best framework as possible. But we should not be naive that many things that will actually happen in the real world are influenced by other rules that are not governed by the COPs nor the UNFCCC, right? I'm thinking about the debt issue. I'm thinking about illicit financial flows, unfair trade rules, the cost of capital. All those things have also to be connected to the climate finance conversation to make sure we, in the end, provide finance that is meeting the needs and human rights obligation. Thanks, Penina. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for putting that quite clearly, really emphasizing the need for still calling for reform of the global financial architecture, but also on what you mentioned about, the three pillars on quality, quantity, and accountability, and what really are the gaps that we see continuously, still impacting how are we able to actually get the right climate finance amounts, and also the resources that would be able or ideal for global south countries to actually also meet their needs, both developmental needs and climate needs. So I'll be glad to really now pass it on to Juliet, because this now puts you in a position on where, reclaiming the power, understanding the role of the IFIs, and how to demand for corporate accountability, but also in unlocking climate finance and climate justice for the global south. So you're welcome, Juliet. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Penina. And greetings to everyone who's on the call now. Please, I'll kind of turn off my video when I'm speaking so that I don't get any internet issues. Yeah, so I would like to really start with the numbers. I think my colleagues have already touched on them to re-echo, because as we're talking about climate finance, it's really important that we ground ourselves in the quantities, the figures. So in terms of loss and damage, about 100 billion is required per year in loss and damage in Africa. The IMF itself estimates that for adaptation, at least we need that developing countries need at least 1% of their GDP. This is for 50 low-income countries. So when you listen to all these numbers and what colleagues have said, it just shows how important it is, how important climate finance is to transition to low carbon economies and low carbon societies. Also, the Paris Agreement itself really is built on the premise that there should be finance flows from at least from developed countries to developing countries, or rather the global south to the global north to global south countries. The role of the role of international financial institutions like the World Bank and the regional multilateral development banks really is to provide loans and grants and technical assistance for climate-related projects. But we should also remember that these have been in pre-existence to provide developmental assistance to countries. So they've been framed on colonial framework that provides loans to countries that are on their development pathway. But then the additionality here is that they are also developing climate investment funds. However, the policies and frameworks of the IMF, the Multilateral Bank, still really remain gender blind and that do not really address the context of developing countries. They have continued to use policy frameworks that are colonial, making it difficult for countries to access funds for climate financing. And this difficulties is in how long the processes are for countries to access those funds. The power that is there when in terms of decision making power is really concentrated in wealthy nations that are also very responsible for the climate crisis, at least 92% of the climate crisis. There's a lot of inequality in terms of operations between the global north and global south countries. And in the framing of the policy, the multilateral development banks or the IFFs, they still enable harsh measures such as austerity and loan-based grantings to the global south nations. I think colleagues have highlighted on the lack of transparency, but also in that the climate finance that is coming to the global south, it's coming in terms of loans. At least 70% of finance is in terms of loans. I think this is to just discuss to show a bit what is their role, but what should we be doing as a feminist organization? I think I always say that, borrowing from Thomas Sankara, he said, if we don't pay, we won't. If we don't pay, we will not die, but if we pay the loans, we will die. I think we should continuously push for these debts to be cancelled, because this borders around human rights and people's lives. We have seen in many African countries, even in Zambia, where I come from, our governments are spending so much money paying back loans, either climate finance loans or loans that have come through other loans, types of loans that have come through the World Bank and the IMF, but also they're imposing austerity measures on our countries. We are not having enough national fiscal spending to even spend on the climate crises that we are experiencing ourselves. We should call for more grant-based financing. We should need to call for reforms in terms of how the financial architecture is formed, in terms of power balances between the global north and the global south countries, and within the decision-making processes of these policy frameworks. Rebecca spoke a lot more around adaptation and the need to call for more adaptation-based funding. We really need to double adaptation because a lot of the funding is going to mitigation. I think one of the things that is coming up and that we need to discuss more is how do frontline communities actually access this funding directly? Because a lot of what is happening is that a lot of money goes through so many processes and is not reaching the communities. We need to think around how to ensure that the frontline communities, the women, the youth, the children are accessing these funds. I think my last point really is to call for civil society to continue calling for reparations for the colonial injustices that have been done over a long period of time in terms of reference to the climate crisis. Thanks, Penina.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for putting that quite clearly. And just mentioning on some of the things that you're mentioning, calling for debt cancellation, of course, has been really at the forefront of a number of different positions that civil society and other organizations have been pushing for, but also looking at, the discussion on what would it mean for also the loans that are being incurred really over so many of the countries in the global south that have had to deal with more of paying back, but also what we need to push for on, grants-based financing. So thank you so much. And the feminist perspective is really, very well represented from you. I'm happy to look at now from what you ended with the reparations-based climate finance. And this is where we invite Adrián from La Ruta, looking at from La Ruta del Clima, where he's able to put into discussion really advancing a reparations-based framework to radically scale up resources for climate justice, but specifically, on how do we shift the narrative of climate finance to historical and financial accountability, but also with the work of the advisory opinions today, they are shaping the discussion right now around climate justice. So it's really important to have that discussion with you, Adrián. So you're welcome and join.
Thank you, and I apologize for not being able to stay after because I have to leave, but I really appreciate the invitation, Penina, and all your team. I'm always happy to speak about reparations and loss and damage, and I think the document that was published makes something very important, addition to the discussion, which is reparations finance. Loss and damage is reparations to loss and damage and there is a significant difference between what Article 8 talks, which is an additional obligation to cooperate, and the obligation of repairing loss and damage, which is the core obligation. The fact that there is a wrongdoing by states that is not only infringing human rights, but also infringing international law, it has been recognized by regional courts such as the Inter-American Court and by the ICJ. There is no barrier to claim responsibility on loss and damage and to demand reparations and to demand for harm to cease and to stop. And that is something that we have to acknowledge. And if we think about how do we shift the narrative, I think we have to stop being so complacent on what the UNFCCC provides and more stringent in terms of what are our rights. So if we have rights, and if as Jose Martí said, if we have rights, we have to take them. We have to exercise. If we don't, then they don't really exist. And that is the bottom line. In the UNFCCC discussions of parties, even after the advisory opinion, are not thinking about implementing how to provide finance for reparations and loss and damage. They're just thinking about maintaining the status quo. So if there is such a right, we have to first claim, as the Inter-American Court says, the third pillar of the climate action is repairing loss and damage, which is not the same as funding the loss and damage fund that is not under obligation, that does not repair, that does not provide remedy, that it is not built to protect human rights. That is the bottom line. We cannot just keep going promoting processes because that's what there is in the process, and somehow we feel that that is the role of NGOs. that is an approach that is generating negative effects for the rights of people, we have to focus on what the court says. And there is an obligation at national level, at least from a human rights perspective, to provide mechanisms for communities that are being harmed by climate change. And it is a specific type of harm. And there is an obligation also of countries to find a way how to enable these mechanisms of repair in our countries. And that most likely goes through the UNFCCC. But at least from our own countries, and I've spoken at least to 2 delegations by now, there seems to be no worry, no change into how to get this reparations finance. Because we're just focused, oh, Article 8, and let's see what fundraising is the loss and damage fund doing. Fundraising is not the same as finance for reparation. Fundraising is not an obligation. So that is not corresponding to the obligations that the ICJ and in terms of human rights countries have, especially those big pollutant countries that have generated transboundary harm. So I think we have to get serious to shift the narrative in terms of what is finance. Finance for loss and damage, repairing loss and damage is an obligation. There is an obligation to provide it, and we have to create mechanisms at national level for that finance to flow. And if that means that there will be pressure in national governments to provide reparations, then for sure, then we will also have to discuss at the UNFCCC or other UN spaces. And I think we have to push that as our change in terms of how we propose this politically, and how much time do we dedicate to the process that just extend the status quo and ignore international responsibility and ignore repairing the harm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. And just as you properly put it, shifting the narrative on what is finance, and that is the discussion that is coming out clearly in here right now. And of course, looking at the obligations that we continue to push for, that climate finance should be provided and should be, of course, just, should be really based on the quality as well, but also emphasizing that the communities must be at the center, those who receive it. And I like your point about the need for a mechanism or mechanisms at also the national level to be able to push for this, that communities can be able to access climate finance. But also, I would like to see, beginning from the discussion around data is one of the things that we're seeing, and we're seeing that there's so many challenges that climate activists do face, researchers and communities do face in trying to see what is climate finance and how do you decode climate finance. And specifically at CESR, and I'll be bringing Matthew in, he's going to be looking at how to decode climate injustice in relation to climate finance and how to anchor a rights-based framework to demand for change, really shifting the narratives to a rights-based economy. So Matt, you're welcome. Please feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you so much, Penina. I do have a little PowerPoint that I'm going to try to share. Let's see if I can do this without messing it up. Can you guys see it? Is that everybody can see that? Okay, great. Good. Now navigated that snafu. Hey everybody, my name is Matt Juliet. I'm a climate program associate here at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, along with Penina. And I guess first off, I just want to say thank you to Penina and to Auska, who did so much work in setting up this event and connecting everyone across time zones and daylight savings and all of these different things, and getting these great, insightful speakers together to talk a little bit about decoding climate finance. So really appreciate all of your work, Penina and Auska, and thankful to get to share with the other speakers. In this presentation, I'm going to go just a little bit into the Decoding Climate Finance guide that Penina and I and our friends at La Ruta as well co-authored recently. Talk a little bit about that data-driven approach that Penina referenced in sort of her little intro, and also connected to reparative finance and what Adrian was just speaking about a lot. So just to give a little background on both CESR's work and the Decoding Injustice framework specifically. So Decoding Injustice is a research framework, and then it's also a publication series that's really designed to equip researchers and activists and academics and governments and really anyone that wants to learn about the specific topic on how to expose economic policies perpetuating systemic oppression and violating human rights. And the Decoding Climate Finance publication is actually the third iteration of this series. So a few years ago, CESR has a lot of longstanding work in fiscal justice and authored the Decoding Debt Injustice Guide. We also have the Decoding Gender Injustice Guide, which was just published earlier this year. And now this is sort of the third iteration in this series. And just to sort of give a background as to why we chose to focus on climate finance, and Penina referenced this as well in her intro, but when you sort of see the climate crisis as one of the defining human rights problems of our time, we also saw the work that our partners and allies were doing on climate finance as sort of being the solution to that. And with that being the, sort of the seminal problem, it intersected with a lot of the longstanding work that CESR has been involved with in the fiscal justice space, with tax, with debt, and how human rights can really be a game changer in shifting how we approach climate finance. So that was sort of the reason that we chose to focus specifically on the climate finance space. When we wrote the publication, all of the publications in the series are really centered around this three-step approach. So we have the first step, which is interrogate, sort of asking very fundamental questions and using the OPERA framework that Benjamin referenced in his presentation to dive into how these economic systems impact human rights. Then we have a section on data. The second session, illuminate, which is really gathering and visualizing that data to spotlight some of the inequalities that you see in these different realms. And then the third section, inspire, sort of, okay, well, we have the data and we have the analysis from section one. How can we actually apply that and to enact some of the policy changes that Rebecca and Juliet were sort of referencing, both within the UNFCCC, and really to have a more accountable framework there. So just to sort of get into the first section of the guide, we're really asking these very fundamental but important questions like, what is climate finance and why is it important? And, we were really trying to portray climate finance not just as a merely technical or economic tool, but as a mechanism for profound implications with human rights, going through the different categories of climate finance, distinguishing mitigation from adaptation and reparative finance. Also asking, who pays the price, and really stressing the disproportionate burden that we all know is borne by frontline communities, the people that are least responsible for the climate crisis that are currently paying the highest price, and also highlighting intersections with other justice movements. So how does climate finance intersect with tax, with debt, with gender, and these different areas that CESR works on that comes back into play later in the guide when we're sort of looking at policy solutions. The last part, and I think this is really something that we wanted to stress a lot, why is climate finance a human rights issue? We really wanted to shift the narrative of climate finance being viewed as charity or as aid into being a legal obligation under human rights law. We highlight specific obligations within the guide, obviously, the doctrine of common but differentiated responsibilities, right to remedy, economic, social, and cultural rights, like, maximum available resources, extraterritorial obligations. How do we take these and apply this human rights law to really, change climate finance? And also, how do we make sure that we have accountability mechanisms in place so that when they are being violated, we can actually see real change? And then getting into the data-driven approach here, we felt that in order to really reveal some of the structural forces and systemic patterns that produce some of the human rights failures we've seen in the climate finance space, To do that in a really compelling way and to show that, you really have to use data. And specifically, you have to know how to get the data and where to get it, which is not always easy because it can be in a lot of different databases and sources that are not always the most accessible or cognizable, easy to understand. But then once you have the data, also how to analyze and interpret it in a way that makes sense, that can be accessible for wider audiences, that inspires and motivates people to actually make change. And so with regards to, sourcing and obtaining key data, one of the things that we do is we go back through the opera framework that, again, Benjamin referenced in his, and really asking, when we're looking at this data, not just how much climate finance is being provided, but where is that climate finance going? Who is receiving it and why is that the case? We also take you through in the guide how to navigate access to different climate finance databases, Climate Funds Update, the World Bank databases, OECD databases, while at the same time, and this is something that Ruta was really helpful with, keeping in mind that, a lot of these databases have biases. The World Bank has a long colonialist legacy, global, and is a global North institution. And a lot of this data is incomplete or biased. And so we really tried to highlight in the guide, areas where that needs to be kept in mind as well. And then in terms of analyzing and interpreting the data, we talk about, okay, how can we disaggregate and benchmark some of these things so that these numbers, which, climate finance is often talking about billions, hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars, how can we put this in a context so that it's more cognizable and easier for people to understand? So converting into percentages, adjusting for inflation, doing per capita analysis, also how to visualize some of the data. So something that you noticed throughout the guide and something that Auska, my colleague, did a great job is that it's really well designed and it has a lot of maps, charts, and infographics that really portray a lot of the climate finance data in a way that is, attractive, but also easier to understand. And so it's tried to model throughout the guide to help other researchers that, hopefully are able to do it in the same way. And then using data to just sort of challenge some of these narratives that we have around climate finance as well, and to stress the obviously increased need for reparative and adaptation finance. And there's a video there of me, which we don't need to listen to. We're already getting enough. And then this third step in the guide is really about inspiring climate action. Specifically, we highlight 4 goals, and a lot of these goals have already been referenced in the other presentations. But the first is dramatically scaling up public climate finance, the inadequacy of the NCQG from the last COP, which Rebecca went into in much greater detail, striving for greater adaptation finance, and sort of the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. The second is improving the quality of climate finance. And again, this has already been discussed, but moving away from the loan-based system to a more grant-based system, ensuring that frontline communities are the ones actually receiving this finance, which is, as we know, not always the case. Making human rights the foundation of climate finance. So how can we establish accountability mechanisms so that when countries do violate these human rights obligations that we've already discussed, there's actually a way to hold them accountable and make sure that they're paying their fair share? And also demanding the rights-based reform of MDBs. So transitioning away from financialization and private sector emphasis and actually delivering the public climate finance that we need. So I hope I haven't gone too much over time here. I wanted to just give a little background on the actual guide that we've produced and sort of CESR's data-driven approach. And yeah, I look forward to discussing with the rest of you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for emphasizing, just what the Decoding Climate Finance piece is about, and the work that we did with Ruta, which was really to see that we're also, sharing more knowledge and information to researchers and activists, and also seeing that we're able to, have benchmarks, on how to measure injustice, but also offer strategies and advocacies that can shift power. So it's really important to see that, how just climate finance could expand access to so many other social spending, as well as also supporting resilient livelihoods. is one of those that we believe strongly that can be able to support communities, but also ensure that climate finance really does be able to actually get to the communities at the center. So thank you so much, Matthew. So I would like to open it up to questions and from the audience. And it's quite interesting seeing that we've had a blend of speakers that have brought together quite a wide range of issues. So would like to kind of also open it up to the audience to raise their hands in case you have any questions. The speakers will be able to attend and be able to actually answer them. I found some that are in the chat. Okay, we have someone who's raising their hand.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
All right. Thank you very much. My question goes to I think it's Matthew and a few others. It has to do with, I think several speakers have addressed the need to transition away from sort of private funds. I think they mean private investment from the north to the global south, and actually focus on delivering public climate financing. Aren't there some structural barriers to that, given the fact that in most of the northern countries, I think the vast majority of investments, particularly in climate projects, is actually coming from the private sector, not public. As a matter of fact, I think it's something like over 80% of climate investment in the north is coming from private sources. So how does that impact? The other question has to do with, ODA is at an incredible, possibly all-time low, right? And we can't rely on local financing because of the effects that will have on currency and the fact that and the cost of capital. So given the fact that the combination of the low incomes, which all have low incomes of global South countries that are historically determined as well. So how do you address those challenges in transitioning to public climate financing? Thank you.
Thank you, Theodore. Thank you for that question. I'll see to which one of the panelists would like to take it on, Rebecca or Juliet or any of you, Adrian or Benjamin, feel free as we still pick up other questions. Adrian, I see your hand is up. I know you have to leave in a few. Possibly you can answer if you have an answer.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting question in terms of investments and ODA. And I think it's especially when you talk about loss and damage and repairing loss and damage, there is no investment there. And I think it's pretty clear. Like, let's think if you crash your car with a house, fixing the car or the house, there is no investment there to be made. And I think that's one of the fallacies from the global north in terms of their obligation to repair the harm. There is no money to be made from the global north, and there shouldn't be money to be made on their obligation to repairing the harm. And I think that is that idea where you have to profit on financing the harm. It's something that does not conform with international legal obligations. And it is also not about cooperation in terms of charity, in terms of development aid, because there is not an assistance that is needed. There was a harm that was caused due to a profit-driven activity that harmed the climate and then generated adverse effects on people that have economic and social and ecosystemic implications. That there is no investment. And I think that is one of the key narrative mistakes when we talk about financing the third pillar of the Paris Agreement. And it all goes back to negative externalities. This issue in terms of economics is about including or reintroducing the negative externalities of a failed model of economics. And you cannot profit with introducing back the negative externalities. It is a cost. and countries in the global north have to pay the cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. And Matt, you'd like to also answer the same, or is your hand forward?
Yeah, I would just add very quickly to Adrian's already great answer that, this is sort of why this goes hand in hand with the fiscal justice work too, that like CESR does. Like a lot of these things are indistinguishable in terms of how can we raise the public funds that we need to be spent on climate finance? Well, it comes from a new economic paradigm in the tax system that, is going on right now with the in the UN tax process. It comes from shifting over to actual grant-based finance in the debt space instead of loan-created finance. So it intersects so much with these other issue areas that CESR is working on. And that's why our work is focused on really bringing out a new economic paradigm, not just single policy shifts within the climate finance space.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for emphasizing that. And yeah, and I know Khan also from Rebecca has been doing a lot of work on reclaiming public finance. So yes, Rebecca, would like to share your voice into this.
Yeah, I don't want to be too long. Thanks, Penina, and thanks, Matthew and Adrián. I subscribe to everything you said. Maybe just to add a bit of a kind of political context where we are now, just a week before COP. So the question of public finance and the role of public finance within the climate finance landscape has always been very contentious, right? If you look back at the 100 billion goal and the way it was framed, we were talking about provision and mobilization, right? And provision refers to the direct obligation from states to provide public finance, basically, to developing countries, according to Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. What happened with the NCQG decision last year, and what is one of the worst consequences of that decision, is that we are slowly moving away from that very clear and central obligation, responsibility from those who created the climate crisis in the first place. Because the NCQG decision is not referring very clearly to that obligation to put public finance on the table, we are seeing more and more attempts to shy away from those responsibilities by crowding in more private sector, by using instruments that are dominated by the global north and are allowing them to use false accounting methodologies, etc., etc. So I think it's very important for us as civil society to recenter the conversation around public finance. I agree with the person who asked the question. It's not an easy time to be talking about public finance because of ODA cuts, because of the retreat of international solidarity everywhere, because of trade wars that are in the end affecting also, developing countries' economies and budget. But it is central, because if you are through to the question of the justice component of mitigation, of adaptation, of loss and damage, and as Adrián was saying, there is no profits to be sought in all of those pillars. Of course, private sector has a role to play. There is a part of the just energy transition that has to be just, and for that has to be funded through public finance and with public institution at the core. So I think we also need to really be clear and courageous about that conversation, even if it sounds not realistic in 2025. It is how we're going to fight together for climate justice, and that's directly connected to public finance.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for putting that clearly as well. The need to reclaim public finance and still keep the discussion going with demand for that public finance. Yes, Juliet, you had your hand up, but if you, okay, you can go. Yes, Juliet.
My hand, but I think Rebecca has been very clear, was very clear around some of the issues, but also to say that I think one of the things that has happened over the years has really become the commercialization of the climate crisis. I think we really need to really recenter and move to a people-centered, looking at the crisis as a people-centered issue. And over the years, we're also losing a lot of principles of some of the Paris Agreement are being lost, and one of the principles that we must really uphold is the principle on the common but differentiated responsibilities, acknowledging that the global South countries have not caused this crisis, and the people that have caused this crisis must be accountable for the damage that they have done, and the position that they leave global South countries in. Yeah, so yeah, I think for me that, but also looking through when we talk about private sector and you see how the crisis is being commercialized, you see how extraction continues to be propelled in the frameworks, the methodologies that private sector works with, and this is what we want to move away, from.
True, I agree. And just really on the need to go against the whole commercialization of the climate crisis, but also seeing how to recenter the people and the planet is very crucial. And I'll just also read I think some of the questions that we received in the Q&A. If Ronald, I think, had mentioned, his concern is on grassroots organizations. Oh, okay. We have maybe just one person who has raised the hand, but I could read this, that his concern is on grassroots organizations who are eager to participate at COP30, but are incapacitated financially. Is there funding aside to accommodate such a community-based organizations? And I know there have been challenges around this on how it's becoming increasingly challenging for organizations to participate this year. But we will see about that in the discussion. Yes, Tamara, please feel free to talk and give your question. Over to you, Tamara.
Wonderful. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the session. Really lively discussion. Just a little bit about myself. So I'm as a climate lead at Georgetown's Institute for Women's Peace and Security. And I also had worked at the World Bank Group for 8 years, working on gender and climate finance. So just wanted to ask the panelists, so where do you see possibly performance-based contract or maybe results-based financing requirements? Like, where do you see those financial mechanisms like linking to advancing women's leadership and livelihoods and climate security outcomes? And then, because I'm sure you guys have done a lot of, different math and things like that, where do you believe that scaling up concessional financing and dedicating maybe at least 30% of adaptation finance to women's cooperatives or SMEs and local associations, like, is that enough? Or do you think it needs to be nearly 40%? Or what is kind of the math showing you in terms of advancing and improving women's outcomes and in climate security? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you for that question. Juliet, I know you have really the feminist angle to the climate justice. So if you're able to attend to that, that would be great. But I also welcome the rest of you panelists to be able to see how to also answer. Don't let me limit any of you in case you have your right answer to this. Oh, I see Benjamin is up. Yeah, yes, Benjamin. Okay.
Sorry,
yes, Benjamin.
There. Okay. Yeah. I mean, on the very sort of specific question, I'm not a finance expert. I'm a human rights expert, but when we're talking about should climate finance be gender responsive, there's not a percentage I would put on it. I would say all climate finance should be gender responsive. When we're talking about specifically what quantity of finance to make accessible to people or communities or rights holders, again, I wouldn't be in a position to say a specific percentage, but a heck of a lot more than the close to zero that it is right now, right? And enough to meet the actual needs of people and respect, protect, and fulfill their rights. So, I mean, finance should be adequate. to respect, protect, and fulfill rights, whatever quantity that is. And whether we're talking about mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage, it just needs to be adequate. And all people have a right to access remedy, right? So, again, we're talking often in the climate negotiations of a political context of what is feasible, or how much can parties agree to in a consensus-based process. And that results in really flawed outcomes where loss and damage isn't a matter of accountability. It's just like, whatever you can convince the countries most responsible for climate change to agree to pay as a voluntary amount. And that's completely inconsistent with the idea that they actually have a human rights obligation to pay up, and polluter pays, et cetera. And I think those inconsistencies are really clearly drawn out by the ICJ advisory opinion. And we have to be conscious of the fact that the UNFCCC process just isn't designed to address these things. And the ICJ is very clear that it is not the only law that governs climate, right? That human rights obligations apply. And so that's one thing. On community-based participation, access of grassroots organizers, finance is an important enabler of participation, but there are a lot of other barriers too. So, I'm aware of a number of organizations that provide financial support for the participation of people and rights holders in climate negotiations. They also need badges, and the accreditation process and the badge availability is challenging, right? They also need visas. So there are accommodation, et cetera. There are a number of challenges to participation in climate negotiation. And we need to look at those comprehensively and seek to address them. Certainly, finance is a big piece of that puzzle, but it's not the only one. And I would just flag that with respect to Indigenous peoples, the UN Voluntary Fund on Indigenous Peoples that's supported by the UN Human Rights Office does support participation of representatives of Indigenous peoples in the climate negotiations, and has done so for a number of years. And that process is periodically initiated through a call for nominations, right? A competitive process, because unfortunately we don't have as much funding as we have interested parties. So, and then finally, I just want to echo, I didn't jump in on the earlier questions, but the points about the need for, more public finance, for considering it as a matter of human rights obligations, for grants-based and concessional finance, et cetera, I think are absolutely correct. Over.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for putting that clearly. And of course, definitely looking at the issues that we see, even in regards to how we're able to still have more of civil society organizations join, in a group, but also, the challenges that come with some of the spaces that we're trying to also voice certain issues that could be a time for us to also see options of, in creating the intersections around some of these discussions and seeing what other fora are there that we can be able to table these issues on. Climate finance, and Matt had mentioned the UNTC, the negotiations happening, but also still to make sure that the communities are the center, and to see how best we can go about it, and not still demand for climate, and still demand for climate justice. So I would like to see, in case there's no other hands up right now, in case you have any itching question that you need to really share to any of our panelists, that would be great. You can still send it in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll still be able to do so. So I would like to put it on back to the speakers, and right now we would like to hear from what your thoughts are really around also your few parting shots, but also in how you'd be looking at COP30. This is a discussion that is quite timely, but also what specific proposals from your different climate justice, human rights side of it, but what would you clearly set as the specific proposals that we should be exploring and setting as alternatives to a dominant narrative present, but also really now ahead to COP30 as well. What are these two major proposals, but also areas that you'd like to continue to see that our demands are much stronger, but also how we could center human rights? So I'll just pass it on to our speakers. Juliet, do you want to go first, or we could take any, whoever is able to? We could start back.
Yeah, I can go first. So as I think as we are going to COP30, I think one of the things that we've really been looking at is for us is to deliver an ambitious GAP. I think there's been kind of a lot of progress that has gone in terms of the GAP, but I think we should push not to only have a GAP being a GAP as a document, but a GAP that has means of implementation, obviously tied to finance, and also ensuring that there's really delivering the representation of women, indigenous people, and human rights defenders, and all the categories of other marginalized people in the policy processes. We are also looking at how do we the Baku to Belém roadmap, the 1.3 trillion. I think that there's need to ensure that is also delivered, because the climate crisis is not waiting for us in the global south countries. We are living the reality of that crisis, and we really need this financing to trickle down to us, and also it needs to be doubled. Yeah.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for clearly mentioning those two. And I can pass it on to Rebecca. If you have, or Benjamin, do you want to go first? Shall we? Okay, then go human rights. Yeah, Benjamin, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Penina. I would say, one, it's not exactly clear what finance-related outcomes there will actually be. I'd like to echo the suggestion from Juliet that the Gender Action Plan and related decisions could emphasize and address means of implementation. I'd like to maybe think about what a cover decision might look like from the Brazilian presidency, and the idea of reflecting commitment to finance being aligned with the ICJ advisory opinion or the obligations found therein, or with human rights. I mean, there are sort of different ways that language could potentially be phrased, and I'm not sure. I mean, frankly, I think either would be a challenging negotiating outcome, but there are certainly different approaches to try to push for better alignment of the messaging and decisions coming out of COP30 with human rights obligations related to finance. And then also, I think the Just Transition Work Program, and thinking about things like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, it's absolutely outrageous that we are still perpetuating and spending public finance to do so, the climate crisis in this way. So that phase out does need to be equitable. There are certainly potential implications for people in vulnerable situations, but there are ways to to phase out those subsidies, which I think should, I mean, it's really just a lowest common denominator ask, which is stop financing the crisis. So those are a few that I would flag.
Thank you, Benjamin. And you do mention the issue of the Just Transition Work Program, and yeah, it's one of those that really is on a focus for civil society to keep pushing, and also, the issues to do with, how to incorporate the advisory opinions is really important, and we really look forward to seeing how that will really take shape in COP30. But we're keeping our fingers also crossed on how best it is to actually incorporate that. Yes, Rebecca, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks. I may just slightly derail from the question you asked, just to give a reflection before answering what we expect this COP to deliver. I think we have to be very mindful of how the presidency, the COP30 presidency, is approaching this COP. And there is a lot of what I call, for lack of better word, informality on the table. So, usually we are following formal negotiating tracks, right? So you have the negotiation at the agenda, and you're expecting a decision to be taken on those, and then you have the kind of regular COP process moving forward. The problem with informal initiative, such as the action agenda, such as maybe you heard about the Tropical Forest Facility Forever, such an acronym, the TFFF, such as the Baku to Belém roadmap, is that they are floating around the negotiation without being really anchored in an accountable tracking system process afterwards, right? So I think, and sometimes, I don't want to be complotist, but sometimes it's part of the strategy of a presidency to distract a bit everyone with a lot of shiny ideas, initiatives, coalitions, and then you have a lot of announcements floating around, and civil society spends more time reacting to that rather than actually remembering what we really want to achieve and what we really need to achieve in the context we are in. So I would just call everyone, and I'm not reflecting to what Juliet and Ben said before me. I think they were pointing at the right things, but just taking a step back and looking, at the media briefing we are receiving, and the different articles that are being published, and how politicians are preparing themselves for Belém. Just making sure we bring back the attention and the spotlight where the needs are, and they are in accountable, transparent processes that needs to be decided upon by the COP. That being said, now I can answer your question. So I would echo what Benjamin said about the Just Transition Work Program. For CAN International and many partners, it's really the key priority this year, because we believe that after 10 years of the Paris Agreement, it's maybe time to try something different and try to do climate action with a real social justice lens, right? So rather than continuing fixing global objective and trying, to have common targets that are in the end not really implemented, I'm not saying we don't need those, but we maybe should think a bit more about how are those targets translated on the ground. What do they mean for the people? What do they mean for the communities? What do they mean for the workers, right? And this is what the Just Transition Work Program is about. How do we marry climate action with justice in a practical manner? So stopping considering just transition as, a preamble or a footnote, but rather as a practical way to do climate policies. And so that's how we approach this conversation. And I think it has a lot to do with climate finance in the end, because you would finance the justice element of climate action in a much more concrete way. And you would connect practical example to the kind of very high level international discussion we are having in the COP. So that for us is really the priority, and the proposition we have is to establish a mechanism, the Belém Action Mechanism, the BAM, so that another acronym, I'm sorry, to actually connect concrete example on the ground to international negotiation. And I'm happy to share the discussion paper we produced about that so that you have a better idea of how it's connected to justice and human rights. And for the second priority, connecting also to the question that were raised earlier, is finding ways into the climate finance architecture we have to continue to secure public finance. So sadly, it's not the finance COP. We had the finance COP last year, and got to know what were the results of that. But so now we have to use the different tracks we have to continue fighting for it. So whether it's through transparency, conversation, reporting and accountability, tracking methodologies, through the adaptation, finance conversation, all those elements needs to create kind of a finance package, for lack of a better word again. Sorry, my English. But just to making sure that in every room, we continue to push for those obligations and for public finance to be provided at scale until we have another opportunity to fight and to reopen that goal that needs to be much bigger and much better defined. Thanks, Penina.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for mentioning the BAM. And it's one of those that, it's quite interesting to see as a civil society that we keep pushing for that, but also how to really center a lot of the discussions, and of course, not being a climate finance corp, but the opportunities that we could see that may arise from some of the discussions in the room, and also by having some of the different sessions that we can organize that can clearly create a much more centered discussion on what needs to be seen still for climate finance and what resources, those resources could actually potentially come in as well. Yes, Matt, and over to you. We'll have just some parting shots and be able to also take it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as some closing remarks, really just mainly listing off a lot of thank yous. Thank you to you, Penina, and to Alsco for really doing so much of the planning of this event and getting all of these great speakers. We're really grateful on behalf of CESR that you took the time to come share your expertise and to talk about, climate finance in a way that, is passionate and actually represents the kind of transformational change that we're looking for. And thank you to all the attendees who took the time, out of your busy schedules to come and listen to these great speakers. In conclusion, what I want to stress on behalf of CESR, and I think that is an opinion shared by everyone in this room, is that, this climate finance injustice that we're experiencing, it's a feature of a larger unjust economic system. As Penina said, it's one that prioritizes profit over the people and the planet. And transforming that climate finance is going to require more than, little policy tweaks, but actually human rights law demanding systemic transformation for those that are most affected. And that's why it was so valuable to hear all of your, demands and things that will extend not just in the upcoming COP, but will continue to impact our work going forward. So thank you all so much for your time. You can find the Decoding Injustice guide at CESR.org. I think we're also happy to answer any questions that people have and follow-ups by email. And yes, I really appreciate such a great discussion with all of my very sophisticated panelists. Anything I missed?
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. And thank you so much for sharing all this literature that you've put in the chat. And I will be happy to also share and disseminate as well to other stakeholders who were not able to be on the call, but also those who have joined, and also any of the presentations that you have, feel free to share with us, to share with the rest. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you once again.
Thank you.